But what I'd like to do, since this is, we are coming up on very, very soon now, the Passover season. You'll be gathering tomorrow night, and then we have the events to take place in the coming week. And so it is that season of the year once again, so I'd like just to have a basic review. This is just basic things today, nothing, no profound new truths. But it's the basic review of the Passover season, why we do what we do, what's in the backdrop of all that we'll be doing, not only tomorrow night, but in the days ahead. I'd like to go back to Exodus chapter 12 while you're turning there. Just a little comment on this event and why it happened. We know, of course, that the children of Israel found themselves in the land of Egypt. They had become a great number, a nation there. They started out with a single family, the family of Jacob, and they started to increase and multiply, and they became a nation there so great that the Pharaoh, a later Pharaoh, began to fear them, and so he enslaved them. And for that reason, that was the situation that we find here when God set apart Moses. And I won't go through the details of that story, but eventually Moses found, or Yahweh, the God of Israel, found Moses and set him apart and selected him for this task of bringing the people of Israel out of Egypt. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about it. I'm sure you have, as you look at this story and read the story of Exodus and all that led up to it, also going back to Genesis, and you see that God had promised Abraham a particular land. I'm giving you this land, and I'm giving it to your seed after you, your descendants, and you'll become a great nation. I've often wondered, why did God do things the way he did? And of course, I think I begin to see some of the answers here actually in the text itself as you read through it. But I've thought, now, had it been me, had God given me the responsibility of deciding how to do it, then I would have just had them grow into a great multitude in the land, and I would have blessed them in the land, and they would have gradually taken over it. In other words, they would have been the dominant people, and the Canaanites would have either moved out or whatever. In fact, I could have blessed them and had them buy land from the Canaanites, just as Abraham bought a piece of land to bury his wife. And so we could, that's a good, that would have been, to me, that would have been the ideal way to do it. Just let them grow into a great nation in the land of promise, and then bless them there, and do all the things that were promised to Abraham. They would become that model nation for the nations of the world. They could have their temple and the sacrificial system, have all of it without having to go through that Egyptian thing. But instead, God chose a different way. He allowed what he did allow. He allowed Joseph to be taken captive. He allowed his brothers to do what they did to him. He could have stopped that at any moment. He could have reversed that at any moment in time. In fact, he could have let Joseph go into Egypt, and he could have brought him back home at any time he wanted to. But he let him stay there for years and years, and let his life play out there. And eventually, of course, you know the story of how he got his brothers back in touch with him, and how Jacob's whole family eventually moved there. And you think, okay, he allowed this famine to go on in the promised land. He could have prevented that. He could have blessed them there, kept them there, brought Joseph home, but he didn't. Instead, he brought them to Egypt and let them become a great multitude in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And there he would he determined, and even told Abraham what he was going to do well beforehand, that he would bring them home from there. And you think, well, why did he do that? Well, there are good reasons for that. Good reasons for that. And we'll see that hopefully as we look through some of this. But you know, there they are. The time does come that God is going to bring them home now, give them the land. That means they're going to have to throw these other people out. So he's going to bring them home, give them the land he promised to them, but he has to get them out of Egypt. And of course, he sends Moses to them, and through a series of plagues, he, continuously, Pharaoh hardens his heart. The plague comes on. He said, oh, okay, maybe I better let the people go. And then the plague subsides and says, nah, changed my mind on that. And on it goes. Again and again, he hardens his heart. It says God hardens his heart, but yeah, God hardened his heart by putting on and taking off the plagues. He hardened his heart by the things he was doing in the land of Egypt. And you think, why all this effort? Why not just do something else? Why? Well, we've already covered that, but that's what he does. And then now we come down to this final plague, and this is the one that's going to break the Pharaoh's knees and cause him to finally submit to the God of these Hebrew slaves, and he will let the people go. Of course, even that's not going to last. He's going to pursue them before they get out of the land. But nevertheless, that's what happens. So let's take up the account there in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, Exodus 12, and we'll see how the Passover was instituted as a memorial of this very event. Chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months." This was the month of Abib. And he says it will be for you the beginning of months. Now that might have been a little bit unique because other nations began their years with a different month. But he says this is going to be the beginning of the months for you. And there's a reason for that. It's because of this act that he performs during that month. "It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month shall every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household." And goes on to give instructions on that. Verse 5, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old." Of course, we see the symbolism in this, don't we? A lamb without blemish. We know the Lamb of God in the New Testament is Jesus Christ. He's the lamb without blemish, without sin, perfect, and yet he dies that death might pass over us. Get a little bit ahead of the story there, but nevertheless, he says, "You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs and this translation says at twilight." This is a controversial term, believe it or not. It's Ben Harbim in the Hebrew. It's related to Ba'irav, which means normally is translated at evening, but this technically, literally, is translated between the evenings. And you say, well, when is this? A lot of people, the controversy in the past has been that this is the beginning of the 14th. It says keep it up and then you kill it at the 14th between the evenings, and some have believed in times past that this is at sunset, which ends the 13th and begins the 14th. From sunset to dark is this period called Ben Ha'arvim. That doesn't work for several reasons, which we'll get into as we proceed through this. Nevertheless, I think most of you know that our position has been now for a good many, since I think about 1983, going back to the 80s in any case, that Ben Ha'arvim refers to the latter portion of the 14th. The 14th, in other words, the afternoon portion of the 14th, and that's when the Passover lambs were killed. We know historically that that's when they did it at the temple. And that is the same time that Jesus, the Lamb of God, died for our sins. So you see how these things line up. So we believe, and have believed for quite a few years, that this Ben Ha'arvim, on the 14th day, Ben Ha'arvim refers to the latter part of the 14th. And therefore, what you will be doing, what we will all be doing tomorrow night, does not align with that. We're not keeping the statutory Passover. We're doing something else, but I'll get into that a little more as we progress. For now, let's focus our attention on this, though. It says, "Then thou shalt take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and lintels of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night. In other words, if this Ben Ha'arvim is the latter part of the 14th, and that night would be in the beginning of the 15th, what we call the night to be much observed. "Roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it." Verse 11, "In this manner you shall eat it with your belt fastened." Now, I ask you the question, why eat it in this manner? That's not normally the way you eat a meal, is it? Normally, you don't have the belt fastened. You don't have, you're relaxed. It's not like you're about to go someplace. No, you want to eat a meal. But it says this, "In this manner you shall eat it with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. In other words, what they're eating there is the Lord's Passover. You're eating that sacrifice. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and beasts, man and beast. And of all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. Now this is very important. You might read right over that without the historical context and not see the importance of this statement. You see, many of those animals in ancient Egypt were considered to be sacred animals. And they're going to be struck too. Their firstborn is going to die too. They were sacred. Why were they sacred? Because they symbolized the gods of Egypt. They perceived that their gods looked like those animals. So many of these animals were sacred. And now when you see the God of Hebrew slaves killing the firstborn, even of these animals, these sacred animals, what does that say? The God of the Hebrews has defeated the gods of the Egyptians. That's the statement. That's the importance of this. So you see, God has a way of doing things. He's going to bring His people out of that land and bring them ultimately to the land of promise. And He's going to, in doing so, He's going to glorify His own name. That's what this is really all about. He is glorifying His own name. He is attaching His own name to this people that He's about to deliver, and thus glorifying His name by showing that He has defeated the gods of mighty Egypt. In those days, Egypt was mighty. Nowadays, how many nations are greater than Egypt? In those days, it was not true. Now, that's not the case. Egypt was a powerful nation, and the Pharaoh was a mighty king. And he was feared and respected by all the surrounding nations. But now here you have the God of the Hebrews defeating the gods of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and also essentially breaking the knees of Pharaoh and making him submit. Now that is going to send a message to the world, much more so than if he had left them in the land of promise and let them grow into a great nation there, where they would have probably taken up the ways of the Canaanites anyway. But here you see God glorifying His own name. Because this is not going to remain in Egypt. Word of this will spread to the nations, as it did. So he goes on to say, again, reading verse 12 again, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. In all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord, I am Yahweh. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you. That's where, of course, the name Passover. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So here it's interesting that something else, not only are the households of Egypt suffering because of the death of the firstborn, but none of the Hebrews are. What kind of message does that send? Again, God is glorifying His own name, and His own name is being attached to this people. That is why He holds them to such high accountability. His name is attached to them. And you know what it means to take the name of the Lord your God in vain? That's, by the way, the commandment is really not about cussing. I don't recommend cussing. But nevertheless, that's not really what it's about. You take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In Israel's case, for example, that God's name is attached to them. He's their special treasure, their chosen people. And when they began to chase after other gods, when they began to violate His commandments, then they're dragging His name through the mud. They're taking His name in vain. That's a lot worse than cussing. But in any case, he goes on to say, after he says, I will pass over you and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day. What day? This day shall be for you a memorial day. Is he talking about the 14th? Is he talking about the 15th? What day is he talking about? Well, let's read on a little further. I think we'll see what he means here. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly. It's an annual Sabbath. And on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone shall be prepared for you. And of course, elsewhere we read, in Leviticus 23, for example, that the first day, and other places, the first day is the 15th day of the month. And the 7th day is the 21st day. We'll see that in just a few moments, in fact, in this text. But it goes on to say then in verse 17, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Now when I read about this day and this very day, observing it forever, I do not see a distinction made from, in other words, I don't see the Passover being offered on one night early in the 14th and then a different night, is this day, reference to this day being observed. No, instead what I find is the Passover sacrifice being offered in preparation for this day, which begins at sunset, and with the meal we call the Passover meal, what is called night to be much observed, when they eat the Passover lamb, and when the death angel passes over, when the destroyer is, God turns aside the destroyer, as it says in let's read that in verse 23, says, for the Lord will pass through and strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses or strike you. So the idea here is there's a destroyer, that's what we call the death angel, who is accompanying God. It's acting as God's agent in going through Egypt, and then God stops him when he sees the blood on the doorposts and lintels of the homes. Don't go there, don't kill the firstborn there. Goes to the next house, somewhere down the way, no blood, the destroyer is allowed to go in and kill the firstborn. So that's the idea there. But it is this day, the reason it stands apart as a memorial, because that is the very event that happened then in the night of the 15th of Abib. That was the event that resulted in the liberation of Israel from the land of Egypt. That's when Pharaoh finally submitted and said, let the people go. So this is the day. Now he goes on to say, therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Now here's something interesting that adds to the discussion on the beginning and ending of calendar dates. It says, in the first month, from the 14th day of the month, get that? From the 14th day of the month, at evening, that's ba'irav in Hebrew, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month, ba'irav, at evening. Now, when do we observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Leviticus 23, it's very clear in Leviticus 23, isn't it? Let me go over there, hold your place here, let me go over there and read that. Leviticus 23, it says, first of all, it says, these are the feasts of the Lord. And the first feast that is mentioned is the weekly Sabbath. Then it comes to the Passover. And it says in the 14th day, the month of the month, Ben Harvim, between the evenings, is the Lord's Passover. And then you go on down and read the next verse, verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. So 15 through the 21st is 7 days, right? So why does this say back here in the first month from the 14th day of the month at evening, ba'irav? What does that mean? Well, look at what it says in the next part of the verse. You shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month, ba'irav, at evening. In other words, until the sun is down until the day ends. So the end of the 14th means what? The beginning of something else. Yeah, the end of the 14th is the beginning of the 15th. So normally speaking, when the Bible speaks of a day, of a given calendar date, and adds ba-irav, it's referring to the end of the day, not the beginning. And so here you have at the end of the 14th, which begins the 15th, you start eating unleavened bread, and you do so for 7 days, and this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It ends ba-irav on the 21st. So that's very simple. Also, you could add to that, back in Leviticus 23, the instructions on the Day of Atonement. It says in verse 32, "It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls." And now we're told in verse 27 that it's on the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. The 10th day. But notice what it says here in the instructions. It says in verse 32, "On the 9th day of the month, beginning at evening, from evening to evening shall you keep your Sabbath." 9th day of the month, at evening? If that means beginning of the 9th day, you got 2 days of afflicting your soul. So it obviously means the end. It better mean the end. No, it means the end of the 9th day, at the end of the 9th day, from evening to evening, from the end of the 9th day, beginning of the 10th, to the end of the 10th. That's very simple, isn't it? This is not mysterious and hard to understand. It's all very simple. So therefore, the related expression between the 2 evenings, or between the Iravs, translated, or from the Hebrew, Ben Harvim, then would also most likely refer to the end, wouldn't it? Something about the end. Now, there are different Jewish commentators, scholars, who know something about Hebrew, and understanding this is an ancient language. Some have, the reason this translation uses the expression twilight is because that is the opinion of some scholars, that its original meaning was twilight. That's that period from sunset to dark at the end of the day. Some scholars think that was the original meaning. But if you look carefully at the different ways this expression Ben Harvim is used in Scripture, you will see that it can't be that tightly defined. For example, look at you don't have to turn there if you don't wish, but over in the book of Numbers. In this case, it's in it's in Exodus. Exodus chapter 29, where it talks about the 2 sacrifices to be offered every day. In Exodus 29 and verse 38 says, "Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 lambs a year old, day by day, regularly." This is the daily sacrifices. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning. Okay, and the other lamb you shall offer Ben Ha-Arvim. There it is, between the evenings. Now, does this mean now that you can offer the first lamb in the morning and the next lamb the next day? The next calendar date? Or on the same? No, the evening then would be the latter part of that same day, wouldn't it? So the evening sacrifice, the other lamb, is to be offered between the evenings. Verse 40, "And with the first lamb," that's the morning offering, "a 10th seah of fine flour mingled with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil and 1/4 of the hin of wine for a drink offering. The other lamb," that would be the Ben Harvim lamb, you shall offer, again, between the evenings, Ben Harvim, you shall offer with it the grain offering, its drink offering, and so forth. So what you have here is a description of the 2 daily sacrifices. The first one is in the morning. The second one on the same day is Ben Harvim, between the evenings. So then if the Passover is to occur on the 14th, Ben Harvim, then that would be the latter part of the 14th, just like the daily sacrifice. The evening sacrifice is in the latter part of the day. So again, none of this is hard to understand. We've made it hard because of a tradition that we once latched a hold of, and once you establish these paradigms, doctrinal paradigms, they're hard to shake loose from, because you want to, no, I love the tradition. I love the old tradition, so that's kind of the way it is. But here we see that pretty clearly that the 14th Ben Harvim means the latter part of the 14th. I'll give you my opinion on what it actually means. the reason it uses the plural. I think it means from the beginning to the end of the descent of the sun. That's what I think it means. The morning is from sunrise until about noon. The ascent of the sun, as it ascends, from our perspective, it looks like it's rising and going on up. And now in the afternoon, it looks like it's coming down. So the descent of the sun from beginning to end, that is Ben Ha'arvim. So the sacrifice of the Passover was offered in the afternoon part of Nisan the 14th, or Abib the 14th. So I believe that is the correct understanding. And it does align quite well with the death of Jesus Christ. He died at approximately the time they would have offered the sacrifice of the Passover, which of course was an all-afternoon event. Now somebody mentioned to me one time that the Jews have it all wrong today because they only emphasize the 15th. They don't have anything going on the 14th. And my response to that is, I'll guarantee you, if they had a temple standing in Jerusalem, then the 14th, the afternoon of the 14th, in fact, all day on the 14th, would be a huge event. That is to say, if Jerusalem was made up, if modern Israel was made up of observant Jews. Now, the people who are there now, a lot of them are atheists, agnostics. The modern Israel state is, of course, a secular state. And if you even suggested building a temple and start offering animals as sacrifices to some god, many of them would be, meaning their God, the God of the Bible, many of them would be absolutely appalled over that. What? That's some ancient, archaic, outdated something that only primitive peoples do. So they'd have a fight on their hands. But on the other hand, if Orthodox Judaism was in the ascendancy and they had their way, and the many people who live there did have their way, who are observant Jews, and that temple was standing, I'll guarantee you the 14th day would be hugely significant in their religious practice, because that would be the day when all those lambs would be brought to the temple and would be sacrificed. Now you may say, yeah, but that wasn't, some people have argued, the temple sacrifice is not biblical. That's something Hezekiah and Josiah and some of the other kings, they instituted it, that's the way they did it, but that's not what God intended. I say, yes, it is what God intended. I can prove that from Scripture. You see, a lot of what we do so often, what many people do, is we conflate the original event, which that's what we're reading about here in Exodus 12. We conflate that with the memorial of that event. And so when you read this, there's nothing about any tabernacle, any temple, or anything like that. The blood just put on the doorpost and lintels of the homes. And so the idea is that some people have is that God intended them to always do it that way. In other words, it'd be a domestic sacrifice, not a sanctuary-centered sacrifice. But that's not true, and I'll show you why I know that's not true. Again, hold your place here. We'll come back to it. Let's look at Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9. And this happens after Israel is out there in the wilderness now. And to give you a little bit of context to this, we'll go back to Numbers, a few chapters earlier, to Numbers chapter, let's see, where do we want to start this? Chapter 7, I believe. Well, yeah, let's look at chapter 7, verse 1. On the day when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle and had anointed and consecrated it with all its furnishings, and had anointed and consecrated the altar with all its utensils, the chiefs of Israel, heads of the fathers' houses, who were the chiefs of the tribes, who were over those who were listed, approached and brought their offerings before the Lord. So here the tabernacle has been constructed and has been set up. They're in the wilderness. They're not in the land yet. They're still in the wilderness. And it goes on to tell, we won't read all of this, but it goes on to tell about the the setting apart of the Levites, what their function would be, about the 7 lamps, and about all of these things that are connected with and associated with the tabernacle. And then it says in chapter 8, verse 23, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this applies to the Levites from 25 years old and upward. They shall come to do duty in the service of the tent of meeting, and from the age of 50 years they shall withdraw from the duty of the service and serve no more. Does that mean I should have stepped down when I was 50? Well, I'm way overdue. No, this is talking about Levites, not ministers, not elders. They minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting by keeping guard. This is what they do. This is Levites, not the priesthood, that their fellow tribesmen, the Levites, by keeping guard, but they shall do no service, meaning they don't offer the sacrifices, they're there to assist the priests, and they keep guard. You want to prevent certain people from coming in there. If they're unsanctified, if they're in uncleanness, ritualistically unclean, then you don't let them in. But they shall do no service. Thus shall you do to the Levites in assigning their duties. Now then, with that context, let's look at chapter 9. Here we see the Passover being observed in the wilderness. And the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. Remember now, the tabernacle is now in place. The priesthood is in place. Sacrifices are already being offered, saying, let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month, Ben Harvim, between the evenings, there it is, you shall keep it. Doesn't say you shall keep it all day. Doesn't say you shall keep it in the morning. Doesn't say it's a 24-hour observance. It says it speaks of a particular time when it is to be kept. And that time is Ben Harvim, between the evenings. You shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its statutes and all its rules, you shall keep it. So Moses told the people of Israel that they should keep the Passover, and they kept the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, between the evenings, Ben Harvim, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the people of Israel did. And there were certain men who were unclean through touching a dead body. You know, it's not just a matter of going washing off the whatever you picked up. This is ritual uncleanness. They were unclean, so they could not keep the Passover. Why? Whoa, wait a minute. Who's to stop them? If it's just a matter of killing a lamb out next to your tent, putting a little blood on your dwelling, and then telling the kids the story, gathering around telling the story of the Exodus and just eating lamb right there on the spot. Now, I've heard stories like that told in the past as if that went on. That's not what's going on here. Understand, that is not what's happening here. But anyway, they could not eat it. They came before Moses and Aaron on that day, and those men said to him, we are unclean through touching a dead body. We're ritually unclean. Why are we kept from bringing the Lord's offering? What do you mean bringing? Bringing it where? Is it not obvious? To the tabernacle. That's where all sacrifices were brought. So when somebody tells me that the temple or the tabernacle or sanctuary-centered Passover was not instituted until way later, I say, no, you need to go back and read what Moses himself said, what God revealed through Moses. This is talking about that sanctuary that had just been erected, and now then these men could not bring their offering, their Passover sacrifice, on the 14th day between the evenings to that tabernacle and offer it because they were unclean. We were kept from bringing the Lord's offering at the appointed time among the people of Israel. And Moses said to them, wait, that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. This is where the second Passover instruction comes from. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if any one of you or of your descendants is unclean through touching a dead body, or is on a long journey, he's far away from the tabernacle. If he's on a long journey, he shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. What? Where he is? No. Here's how he's to do it. In the second month, not the first month. In this case, in this exception, in the second month, on the 14th day at twilight or between the evenings, they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any of its bones. According to all the statute for the Passover, they shall keep it. But if anyone is clean and is not on a journey, fails to keep the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people, because he did not bring the Lord's offering. Again, I ask, what does the language mean here? Obviously, it means bringing an offering someplace, doesn't it? And it means bringing it to a tabernacle. Now, how was it that these men were kept from bringing their offering? We just read about the Levites, didn't we? They were to guard the tabernacle, to keep anything unclean from entering. And so these men were prevented, no doubt, by Levites from bringing their Passover sacrifice to the holy place to defile it. So that's the reason right there. So don't tell me that the sanctuary-centered Passover was a later invention. No, God himself invented it right here. And that's the way it's to be done. And the same language is used. 14th day, Ben Harvim, that's used back in Exodus 12. 14th day of the first month, Ben Harvim, between the evenings. So I have to say it must be a reference to the same time. Anyway, enough of that. Back to Exodus chapter 12. And skipping on through, let's see, verse 25, and when you come to the land that the Lord God will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshiped God. Then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did. So it goes on to further describe that, what they did. It talks about the Exodus, how many came out. It says, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses. That's where they were. And by the way, this is another mistaken idea that a lot of people have. They said they had to leave Goshen and go to this supply city called Ramesses, or Ramses, and that's where then the next night they began the Exodus. No, they were in Ramses already. That's where they lived. You go back and check it out in the book of Genesis. That's where they were placed, in the land of Goshen. Ramses was in Goshen, and so that's where they were. They were already in Ramses. They didn't have to leave Goshen and go to some other Ramses, which was maybe 10 miles away, and then prepare to leave that next night. That's not the way it happened. They left from Ramses and went to Sukkoth. About 600,000 men on foot. These would be foot soldiers. Now it goes on to say, besides women and children, a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And you start doing the math on it, and different people come up with different figures. But if you take those men, those are just the foot soldiers, the 6,000 men, 600,000 men. And some say there may be a translational issue here. I don't know for sure. In any case, when you look at this, even if you go for the lowest figures, you have a massive number of people, don't you? A massive number of people. Now, when and also their livestock went with them. And I'm sure they didn't move at the speed of light. They had old people, young people, all kinds of, it's got to be a slow-moving, massive number of people with their animals, the livestock. It's not like on rawhide where they, really get them moving, head them up, move them out. No, they headed them up, but slowly moved them out, no doubt. So they settled it took off, and then it goes on to tell you in Numbers, in the book of Numbers 33, I believe it is, that it gives you the stages of the journey. In any case, we won't go there. But the point is, this was a huge number of people. Now, when they got into the wilderness, I ask you this. When they got into the wilderness, in that second year, when they did have the tabernacle in place, and they were bringing their offerings, their sacrificial offerings, the Passover offerings, to the tabernacle, you understand that the blood was placed on that one altar, or dashed against it, supposedly, sprinkled on it, however they did it. Now, I don't know how many people had a sacrifice. I don't know, it might have been several people, several families had the one that were together. I don't know. But regardless, even taking the lowest figure you can come up with the number of people that were there had to be a huge number of sacrificial animals. Do you think they did all of that in bringing it to that one temple or one tabernacle, the one altar, in a narrow window of time between sunset and dark at the beginning of the day, and got all that done? No. It takes some time. Now later, when they were in the land, and you had a far greater number of people crowding into Jerusalem on the 14th with their sacrifices, and they did bring them to the temple. They brought them to the temple. The sacrifice took place there, and they were very organized in how they did it, and they managed to get it done over the course of the afternoon. But you had, according to Josephus, he could be exaggerating, I don't know, but as many as a million animals were sacrificed on that day. You think they did that in the narrow window of time between sunset and dark? Got all that blood on that one altar? Everybody crowded in there and got that done in that one narrow window of time? I don't think so. It took all afternoon to do it. In fact, you look at the example in Josiah, you see that so many sacrifices were brought that they were still working into the night, getting it all done. So, no, I don't think, for a number of reasons, the early 14th view doesn't work very well. But in any case, we could go on, and his point here, what he wants to, I won't read the whole thing, but he makes the point. I'll just read a little bit from chapter 14. This is when they come to the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pihahiroth," however you pronounce that, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Beelzebub. Now here's the interesting thing. He could have taken them out by the short route, right up next to the below the Mediterranean, the short route, right into the Promised Land. But there were hazards along the way, and they chose not to do that. God could have taken care of all that. He could have taken them that way. After all, He led them with the pillar of cloud and the pillar the pillar of fire and so on. And He could have done that, but He didn't. He let them go this other way, and then turned back and like they're backtracking somewhat as they were camping in various places along the way. And it was no doubt this very thing that the Egyptians saw going on. And they said, aha, these dummies didn't take the short route. They got themselves hemmed in down there. And Pharaoh says, got them now. So that's the idea here. That's the idea. So they turn back, and it says the Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel, they're wandering in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. And then God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will here's the purpose right here for doing all this stuff when he could have done it very differently. I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. I am the Lord. And they did so. So this is the whole point of it. Not only would the Egyptians know it after what did happen, not only would they know it, but word of this would spread throughout the land that they were about to enter into, and the people in those lands would know it. And that's why you find them fearing the people of Israel as they approached. That's why you find them hiring, even hiring a prophet of some sort to come and curse these people, because they knew what very well could happen if they weren't cursed before they got there. So God gained glory. This was to the glory of God. And again, I emphasize, the reason Israel was held to such high accountability is because, not only because they received His law at Sinai, not only because of that, that's one reason too, but also because God's name was intimately connected to them. And because of that, when they did misbehave, when they did pursue other gods, when they did break God's law and abandon His covenant, then it was disastrous for the name of God. So that's why they were held to such high accountability, and why God was so severe in His dealing with them. And ultimately, the severity of God will work out, though, to demonstrate His mercy. We see that in the book of Romans. We're not going to go there today. But that's another important lesson or feature in the entire story itself. So we'll skip over a lot of material, and just want to go over to the book of Hebrews now. Book of Hebrews, just to emphasize one aspect. Here in the book of Hebrews, he's talking about Jesus Christ being a high priest of a better covenant, one better than the one that was made with Israel. And the main problem with the old covenant was not the covenant itself, certainly not with the moral law revealed in the covenant. The problem with the covenant was the people that it was made with. They were violators of the covenant. Because it says in verse 8, for He finds fault with them when He says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But in chapter 8, let's start in verse 4, it says, now if He were on earth, meaning if Christ were on earth, He would not be a priest at all. He's talking about the fact He is the priest according to the order of Melchizedek. He's at pains to explain how superior Christ's priesthood is to the Levitical priesthood. And he says here in verse 4 of chapter 8, if He were on earth, He would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. You get what it's saying here? Those sacrifices according to the law serve as a shadow, a copy and shadow of heavenly things. In other words, of eternal things, of permanent things. They're only shadows, they're not the reality. They foreshadow the permanent, the eternal realities. He says, for when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant He mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For He finds fault with them when He says, behold, the days are coming that I will make a new covenant, and so on. So the point I'm making here is that entire system, the sacrificial system, that would include the priesthood, the Levites that served at the tabernacle, at the area of the tabernacle, that guarded the holy place, and so on. The priesthood, the sacrifices, the tabernacle itself, later the temple, the holy places within it, all the furnishings, all of that was a shadow. It foreshadows the greater reality. Now, when I say all of that, I'm saying also the Passover sacrifice. The Passover foreshadowed a greater reality. And who is that greater reality? I could say, what is that greater reality? But the better question is, who is the greater reality? And that greater reality is, of course, Jesus Christ. As we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. And then Paul, after he says that he says, let us therefore keep the feast, not with the malice and the old leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So the types and the shadows in the sacrificial law, the sacrifices, the priesthood, and so forth, have now, we see in the new covenant that the greater reality is now revealed. The greater reality. And that, of course, is in Jesus Christ. So when we come together tomorrow evening, let's remember that we're not simply revisiting or trying to, in some way, reenact the statutory Passover that was revealed to Moses and the children of Israel. No, we're doing something that Christ himself, Christ who is our Passover, instituted in the night of his betrayal. And what he instituted was the memorial of his death. You look at the Passover, you realize what it really is. Now, for the people of Israel, it was a memorial of the Exodus. But for us, those who are in a new covenant relationship with God, we look at the Old Testament Passover and we see that it was, in fact, a foreshadowing sacrifice. It foreshadowed a reality. It looked forward to the reality who is Christ. And what we do tomorrow night, in taking the bread and the wine and washing each other's feet, what we're doing is we're memorializing the greater reality. So one looks forward, the other looks back. We're memorializing. That's why Christ said, do this in remembrance of me. It's a memorial. So it's the memorial of Christ's sacrifice. It's not merely a kind of a revised statutory Passover. That's not what it is. So let's keep these things in mind. Let's remember who our true Passover is. Let's remember the sacrifice he offered for us. And let's remember that when we take the bread and the wine tomorrow evening, not only does that bread and wine symbolize what was before symbolized in the Passover sacrifice, not only does the greater reality, I'll put it this way, not only is the greater reality which takes in the truth, which encompasses the truth that was symbolized in all those sacrifices, not only the Passover sacrifice, but the sin offering, the trespass offering, the peace offering, and the Passover. All those Old Testament sacrifices, the truth contained in them now has come to the reality. The substance, the shadow has met the substance in Jesus Christ. And what we're doing tomorrow night encompasses, it takes in all of that. So let's remember that when we take the bread and wine. And remember what a sacrifice he did offer for us. For each of us, not only us collectively, but for all of us, each of us as individuals. That's why he is our personal Savior.